Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly advocacy update. I'm Austin Harris, the Director of Member Engagement at KASB, and it's a joy to have you with us this afternoon. I feel bad because you all missed an absolutely riveting conversation in our green room about the just horrible state of Sirius radio and satellite radio in Chevy vehicles. So we'll try to get that information to you because that's really the critical piece of what we're talking about. But instead of continuing that dialogue, we're going to focus in on what was an action-packed and very strange week in the world of both state and national politics. We inaugurated a new president, had security concerns that changed the way the Capitol operated, and had several bills introduced in the state legislature that we're keeping a close eye on. So as always, to bring you that information, I'm joined by our fantastic advocacy team, Mark Tallman, Scott Rothschild, and Leah Fleiter, here to give us the most up-to-date information in action coming out of the state legislature. The big news this week was two separate voucher-based bills introduced in both the House and the Senate K-12 education committees. But before we get to that, we want to talk a little bit about some non-voucher action that was taken in the legislature. So Mark, why don't you get us started with what some of those bills look like?
Okay, thank you, Austin. You've let me calm down a little bit from that conversation, but still a little bit on edge. I thought before we plunge into that, we could talk a little bit about some of the maybe groundwork that's being laid. And I know, despite the fact that a lot of committees were canceled this week because of security concerns, nonetheless, a few went on, several in the education committees, and Scott and Leah and I were all part of these. So I'm going to say something that probably you guys are getting sick of me hearing, but looking at your faces, I hope you're doing something about this, because it still comes back to helping our legislators understand issues where there's a lot of skepticism. Several committees this week were briefed on the legislative post-audit recent audits. So I want to take just a minute to remind you what they are and some of the questions so that you can be thinking about what you would share with them. So number one, new audit on cash balances. Legislative post-audit basically looked at that and they didn't have any problems. They basically said, hey, school cash balances have been increasing. Most of the increase has been in restricted funds. A lot of that is tied to like higher building costs and bond issues. There's reasons why districts have balances. The best practices seems to have about 2 months in your operating fund. The districts they sampled, were about half above, half below, on average, not bad. But legislators continue to believe that districts are, socking away excess money. And one of the things that was a question, I'll note, is LPA said a best practice is to have a written plan or written guidelines on what that will be. And they said, most of the districts we talked to didn't have one. They kind of had their reasons when they asked them, wasn't in writing. So, I go back to saying a lot of the narrative is simply this. You're always asking for more money. You're always saying you don't have enough money. Why are your reserves going up? And why aren't you spending those to deal with unforeseen emergencies like a COVID pandemic? So we know there are reasons. And again, I think this audit explained well why that is. But I would strongly encourage all of you, administrators, board members, whatever, to communicate with your legislator. Hey, a new audit just came out. Want you to know, here's why we do what we do. Here's what's happened in the last several years in our district and why. Here's why we've put more money here, or if we spend it down here. They're going to have to hear that. Second audit that came out this year was on bilingual education, basically looking at how districts spend the money they get through the weighting, if they add any other monies to that. This one, the auditors basically said, we didn't see any administrative problems, but we also didn't find that bilingual students do very well. And when they come out of these programs, that supposedly having received the benefits of bilingual education, they continue to lag behind. We don't see continued improvement. So the narrative is you may be spending the money appropriately, but not well. And so one of the questions that is being asked, have you evaluated your bilingual program? Why are you doing what you do? Are you doing? Have you looked at new research or best practices? Because that is a group of students that consistently has lagged. So I would invite you to do the same thing. The news hook is, here's a new audit. Almost every district in the state gets bilingual funding and spends it in some way. So sharing with your legislators, what do we get? How do we spend it? Why do we spend it that way? And how do we evaluate the results is absolutely critical, because that's not what the legislators are hearing at this point. And then the final thing is, from a year ago was a post audit on at-risk funding. Narrative was very similar. Districts are getting $450 million in at-risk funding. They raised questions about how it's being spent, about how it's being evaluated. Our at-risk students do continue to lag. And so we need to have a conversation from every district. What are you doing with the money? How are you deciding the programs you're using it on? How are you evaluating those programs? Because the subtext from the legislature is, we're not sure this money is being used right, so we're going to tell you how to use it, or at a minimum, we're going to tell the state board to tell you how to use it. So if we want to continue to have some flexibility, how do we demonstrate that's being well used? So again, the climate at the legislature, as we said, skepticism, concern over COVID, over everything, concern over funding, and so how are districts spending their money? So Scott, Leah, those were kind of the audits. What else did you hear? Is there anything I'm missing? Well, you're both remaining muted, so okay, Leah, go ahead.
I would just say, I would echo Mark's comments about skepticism, sometimes outright hostility. So just, I would say, be prepared for that and be able to explain why you're doing the things you do. You know, we heard about that at-risk audit, and sure enough, there's a bill been introduced to give at-risk kids access to education savings accounts. We don't even have a number on that yet, but you know, it doesn't take very long for some folks to get that information and introduce a bill to, you know, fix it. So just be aware.
Yeah, and concerning the at-risk audit, there was a briefing before Senate Education, and it was kind of like, why are we briefing this? This is like from 2019, so it was kind of interesting. So I think they're kind of bringing out their greatest hits and trying to use these things to criticize public schools.
And since our group is not too large today, I think later we certainly want to take your questions or comments. We may even open up to let you do that in person, but you have the chat. So if you have any questions, but I want to come back to something Scott said, because that's important. That at-risk audit is now, you know, was from last year, but remember that got tied up to the sunset on the high density weighting, which is about $50 million to districts with higher percentages of low income kids. That was due to expire. It was extended for 2 more years by proviso in the budget bill, but a budget bill proviso expires. So at some point, the legislature is going to have to make a permanent fix. And last year, both the Senate Ed and K-12 budget committees were looking at extending it only for a limited period of time, only for changes in state boards oversight, and wanting to come back and say, now, what are we seeing? Are we seeing any improvement in this area? So be aware, the legislature is unlikely to simply say, okay, here you go again. We're going to have to be prepared to show how those dollars are being used and what evidence there is that it is kind of moving the dial on achievement, because that's what this legislature is now focusing on, is going to continue to do in at least the near future. So are there any questions about either those audits or this kind of general theme of legislators looking for answers around how we're spending money, accountability, and student results?
Not seeing any just yet. As Mark mentioned, the chat is always available to you to drop those questions in. If you have some you'd like to kind of ask verbally, feel free to unmute and ask those as we go throughout the program today. Mark, I'll keep my eye on the chat, and if we get any questions on that, I'll share them with you. Leah, we also saw some action in Fed and State around House Bill 2059, dealing with concealed carry licenses and policy. What update do you have for us there?
Austin, there's been a bill introduced to allow 18 to 21-year-olds to conceal carry. And that bill will be heard on Tuesday in the House Federal and State Affairs Committee.
Actually,
Go ahead,
Wednesday.
Mark.
Actually,
Wednesday? Okay, Wednesday. I looked at the calendar wrong. Wednesday. So House Fed and State will be having a hearing on Wednesday about a bill that would give 18 to 21-year-olds the right to conceal carry. As you all know, we have 18 to 21-year-olds who attend our schools. And so this could be something that you might be concerned about. You say, oh my goodness, how can that be? Now, we want to remind you that state law already requires legal concealed carry permit holders to leave their weapons in their, I believe it's in the trunk, but anyway, in their car before they go into school. So they're not allowed to bring them into school buildings anyway. So this does not necessarily really change the impact on you and your schools. But those of you, especially I imagine the administrators might be concerned about this. If you would like to communicate with the House Fed and State Affairs Committee about this bill, I think Austin put the link in the chat there. Thanks, Austin. That's a link to contact the committee members. And if you want to communicate with them or submit some of your own legislation on that, we would welcome you to do that. We're going to just kind of be monitoring the hearing. But as I noted, it doesn't change the law that requires those with a concealed carry permit to leave their guns in the parking lot at school. So certainly something that kind of raises eyebrows, probably doesn't impact you directly, but if you have concerns about it, please feel free to contact the committee and express those concerns. Oh, and Donna said, yes, locked in the vehicle and out of sight. So that's the requirement of the state law there. Thanks, Donna, for that.
Which is really the point of concealment.
Yes, exactly. So that's that issue that we'll be monitoring, but we encourage you to take your own action on that if you feel that's necessary.
Fantastic. Appreciate the update on House Bill 2059, Leah. Mark, what can you tell us about the Promise Act?
There's a couple bills coming up this week in Senate Education that are really carryover from last year that were either vetoed or didn't get passed before the legislature ended. And as I think we've talked to you about, there's this sense in the legislature that they really have to hurry on things they really want to do in case they may have to get shut down again because of COVID. So the Promise Act is a bill that actually, I believe it had passed both chambers and was actually it was passed in the special session and vetoed with some other bills. It is essentially just creating a new state scholarship program for post-secondary kids up to 2-year program. So basically associate's degree or technical certificates. This would create a way to aid those students. We're going to testify in favor under the guise of language that our delegate assembly just adopted on the importance of aiding kids with post-secondary attainment. We know that as schools are increasingly judged on kind of preparing kids and having kids move into the system, we know the state needs to continue to raise the education level of its workforce, and we know cost can be a barrier. And I think there's a real concern that people sometimes talk about the COVID generation may set back, a lot of kids from getting that post-secondary education, which is so critical to lifelong earnings and that sort of thing. So that's one bill. Would also note that on Wednesday, that same committee, Senate Education, is having a hearing on a same bill from last year that would allow, but not require, school districts to pay for the concurrent or dual enrollment courses if you've got students that are getting credit from your district while also attending and getting credit from a post-secondary institution. Under current law, you cannot use state funds to pay for that. Some districts have found other funds. grants and gifts and things like that to do so. But there are some districts that have negotiated some arrangements with post-secondary institutions, and they really want to allow kids to do that at no cost or at a reduced cost. This bill would be permissive and allow you to do that. So again, that was one that looked to be moving last year. It just kind of ran out of time. We think there's going to be more like that. I think we may have mentioned there's a bill on emergency medical supplies in schools that was moving last year. But again, legislature tends to hold everything till the end. And then when we ended a month or two early, a lot of stuff we just didn't get to. So that's another bill that was just introduced with a number. We know that's coming back. There'll be a lot of others. So some of what you hear from us may seem familiar, and it definitely is. So I am going to look at the chat for just a minute. Okay, promise
couple of
scholarship.
questions in there for you, Mark.
Okay.
First, any thoughts about the governor's cut in higher education funding?
Yeah, for those of us who live with members of the higher education community, and they're giving us dirty looks.
Well, that's actually this week. I had a long talk with a good friend of a son of mine, where I had to explain to him the governor's budget for higher education and why, of course, K-12 is getting a $100 million increase as part of our Gannon phase in, and they're falling behind. And it's really pretty simple. Education costs are rising under Gannon. We would justify that. Social service costs are rising, as they tend to always do, but even more so in a recession. State revenues are not rising because of that same recession. And the governor put together a budget with a 7.5% ending balance. So I don't want to oversimplify it. It's really just math. And so it's kind of like we've talked all along. There's a lot of state programs that are not getting any increases or are being cut, but the legislature is going to have to square that with different priorities, including what I know Scott's going to talk about in a minute, and that is the some tax cut issues. But let me look, Lawson, I think I can read these. Question: Promise bill includes tuition waiver for concurrent for foster kids. Good point. Thank you, Kathy. Maybe you've read my testimony, because I also noted that we have a position trying to improve educational outcomes for foster students. So this would also be helpful in that sense. And it looks like we've got a link in on the concealed carry issue. So does that cover, Austin, all the questions of this round?
Looks like it so far, yes. And so,
okay.
Scott, as Mark mentioned, some action around tax cuts, specifically Senate Bill 22. What can you tell us about that and how it might impact public education?
Well, the reason we're following this is because of the revenue ramifications of these tax cuts. And under Senate Bill 22, well, like many other states, Kansas's tax code is tied to the federal code. And in 2017, President Trump and the Congress, they lowered rates, but they also included provisions that raised taxes on some Kansans, in part by kind of discouraging individual filers from claiming itemized deductions. So Senate Bill 22 has a lot of moving parts. One part would allow individuals to itemize on their state tax returns, even if they don't itemize on their federal returns. Now, based on previous comments by legislators, there seems to be kind of bipartisan agreement to this provision of the bill. That would be about a $60 million reduction to the state treasury. The bill also goes into cutting taxes for corporations, particularly large ones that have operations outside the United States, and then they bring that money back into the United States. It would exempt a lot of this money from taxes. That's another big hit to the Treasury. It also would allow the amounts received from the federal Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, under the CARES Act to be subtracted from income for Kansas income tax purposes. So when you add all these, the itemization and the business tax cuts, when you add them all together, in the next fiscal year, you would see a reduction in revenue of $330 million, which is a significant cut. These tax cuts would continue. In the next year, there'd be about $140 million reduction, and then the next year, another $140 million. And even the fiscal note for this bill, the Department of Revenue says there's a lot of data we don't even have yet. And so the likelihood is this impact could even be greater. So when you're talking about 330 million, 140, you're talking about shaving into core services that the state government pays for. And of course, we're 50% of the budget. So that's why we're going to be following this. Senate Bill 22 is going to be worked by the Senate Tax Committee next week. The House Tax Committee is going to have hearings on similar provisions next week. You know, these kinds of bills have passed before. They've been vetoed by the governor, but we have a much more conservative and I think tax cutting minded legislature now. So the question is, could those vetoes sustain again? So that's why we're kind of following this tax bill, because of the possible ramifications it could have on the state budget and ultimately public schools.
Might also note, when we're kind of talking about the governor's budget and other moving parts, her budget, you might remember from last week, depends on about $80 million in increased revenue from spreading the sales tax to electronic purchases like ebooks and Netflix and those things, and also something I don't begin to understand on marketplace facilitator for collecting sales tax on internet services. And we also know floating around is a lot of interest in trying to cut the sales tax on food, which, depending on what you did, would be an issue. And then there's and then also continuing concern over property tax rates. So about every possible tax cut is probably going to be vetted. My dogs are barking, so I'm going to go to mute and see if anyone has any wise responses to that.
And we don't seem to have any questions in the chat yet on Senate Bill 22 or tax policy. I'll keep my eye on that, and if they come in, we can jump back to it. But until those come in, let's go ahead and move on to a pair of bills that have been introduced to committees in both the House and the Senate on some tuition tax credits. And before we get into the details of those bills themselves, Leah, can you give us an overview of kind of the history of where these voucher programs come from and what the driving force behind this legislation is?
Sure. Thanks, Austin. I think a lot of us maybe think that vouchers are sort of a fairly recent development, courtesy of some think tanks and groups that have been very active on this issue over the past decade or so. But really, vouchers had their genesis in the reaction to the Brown versus Board of Education school desegregation case. The parents of children who would attend desegregated schools, particularly in the South, began seeking vouchers to send their kids to private schools in order to remove their children from desegregated schools. So really, unfortunately, it's a sad truth that vouchers are really an outgrowth of the blowback from the Brown versus Board school desegregation case. So kind of a sad observation there. But over the past several years, I would say the school choice movement has been sort of, some would say co-opted. Maybe you could use another word, but anyway, that the school choice movement has been taken over by folks who just sort of generally oppose public schools. Perhaps they don't like the fact that you don't pray in public schools, or they don't like the fact that you teach certain things, or whatever the reasons may be. The school choice movement has opted into that voucher argument, and those are the arguments that we see pretty much every year, and we will be dealing with again on Tuesday in we believe in Senate Ed and also in the House K-12 Education Budget Committee. So that's a brief overview of vouchers and how we got to where we are today. Mark and Scott, do you want to add any more detail to that?
I don't know whether we want to go into a little bit on the details of the bills. I guess, obviously, probably most of the supporters are not going to tell you this is an effort to resegregate and destroy public education, whatever you think. the reasons usually given. And again, I happen to know some school board members around Kansas who support expanding these because their argument is, hey, the world has changed in a lot of ways. We find a lot of ways to give people different choices. This is just a way to, no one school can fit every child as best as it can. And so why not give people ways to find what they think is a better fit? That's certainly been the recent rhetoric. Betsy DeVos was always saying that, hey, it's not whether public schools are good or bad. We're not saying that. We're just saying there are different schools. Let people find their best fit. Get the best fit. And of course, to anticipate the testimony will be given always comes down to, I think, in our view, the programs we see to this point don't really do that because it's the school that retains the right to decide what kids to serve or what programs to offer. And so while that again may sound good and maybe in an ideal world could work in some ways, the practical reality is the systems that we see and the bills we see don't actually require that. So,
and not only that, Mark, we need to keep this in the forefront. Those voucher programs take money away from public schools. That's, we can all talk about choice and la-di-da, but, we cannot support something that funnels money away from public schools into private schools. And that's a key opposition that KASB and others have to voucher bills.
So if you want to, so just to restate mechanically where we are right now, number one, we believe there is going to be a Senate bill. It has not been introduced, but we think it's the same as the bill that is having a hearing in the House Tuesday, which is House Bill 2068.
Mm-hmm.
And we know there will be other bills on this area, but very quickly, current law passed about 5 years ago established a system where people can receive a 70% credit on your state income tax for contributions you make to approved organizations that then give scholarships to certain students. So step one, the state's involvement is a tax credit for contributions that go to what are called scholarship granting organizations. There are about 10 of those that have been approved to operate in the state. These organizations then can make scholarships to students who meet basically two criteria. One, you have to be free lunch eligible, not reduced, free. It's the same criteria as used for at-risk waiting. Two, you have to be attending or not started school, but would attend if you started public school, one of the 100 elementary schools defined by the state board as having the lowest performance. The shorthand is failing schools. Now, we'll point out in testimony that these schools are in districts that by and large have the highest poverty rates and tend to have higher special ed populations, et cetera. So our argument is these are really schools that have the most challenging students in many ways, but that's the trigger, okay? And then once you have received a scholarship, you can continue to get it, all right? So the bill that we know there's a hearing and one we anticipate would first of all raise the threshold to include free and reduced lunch. So another group of kids would qualify that way. But most significantly, it would be a student in any public school. It wouldn't have to be this 100 lowest elementary. It would be, anybody. And so one thing we'll point out is that in making those changes, you are moving into populations that has a lower chance that these will be high need students, to kind of mix my words, because the one possible argument about the 100 lowest performing schools with high poverty is these are kids who may have higher needs. So if the program has benefits, at least it's focused on them. But the reality is the program does not limit it to kids who are actually having academic difficulties, and that's not traced. So we have no way of knowing whether the students that are benefiting from the scholarships or would in the future are students that are struggling in struggling schools or kids who are doing well in schools where a lot of their peers are struggling, and there's no record of whether they do better or worse or the same when they move to the approved private school.
Mark, we've got a couple of questions here in the chat that I'll throw out to the whole team. First comes from Dr. Heim. Will schools who accept voucher or tax credits be required to comply with the same laws, rules, and regulations as public schools?
In these bills, in the current system, no. In these bills, no. I guess that's not impossible that there could be a proposal out there, but the program that currently exists that we're looking at now does not change any requirements. The participating schools are free to operate as they wish, with one exception. They are phasing in a requirement that you must be accredited either by the state or by a national accrediting organization that is approved by the state board. The vast majority, by that I mean like 95% of these scholarships so far, have gone to the state Catholic schools, which are accredited, but are not required to, of course, comply with other public school laws.
Parse that out a little bit more for us. What are some of those requirements, regulations, and rules that they would be exempt from that public schools fall under?
Well, of course, the fundamental one is that a public school must educate every resident of the district, and can only exclude students for basically a limited time for specific behavioral reasons. So number one, you have to educate everyone, and then you have to provide special education services. You have to provide bilingual services. Most districts will choose to provide a variety of other services. There are some things the public schools don't have to do, but basically they all do. I don't believe there's still a requirement that you have to provide lunch, but you do have to provide breakfast. So in many cases, there are just things that are written in, but I think it starts with the idea public schools can't choose their population. And when they have that population, they have to make a number of requirements to meet those. So that would be one. What am I forgetting, Scott, Leah?
Well, really, private schools could exclude anybody they want. If they don't like the neighborhood that the applicant student comes from, or if they don't like the child's family situation, or they don't approve of their parents being married or not married, or what their parents' gender or gender identity might be. I mean, there's any number of reasons for private schools to reject students who are seeking to use a voucher.
So to clarify, can private schools exclude any student for any reason?
I don't want to give an absolute yes, because I don't know whether there might be some lurking non-discrimination on some ground, but the shorthand answer is I think they pretty much can, or can create other obligations like parental involvement or discipline codes or things like that, which could have the same effect.
Or tithing to the church that supports the school.
Correct.
Or
now,
if you're already a low-income family, tithing is going to be a challenge.
I want to make one comment. John Burke has said the former headmaster of Wichita Collegiate School said they would never accept a voucher. So that it would not surprise me that there are some private schools that would not, because they don't want state involvement, because they may understand an argument that I've also made over the many years I've involved in this, and as some of you may or may not know, I graduated from a private school in Hayes. One of the arguments I always made is, if private schools come to depend on vouchers to operate, then you're accepting public money. And I think the recorded history of public funding is that strings usually follow. And so while this legislature always rigorously writes rules that say, this will not direct anything, you have another legislative majority at some time that looks at these dollars and decides we're going to put these, but by then you've taken the money. But I think the other side of that is, I think there are some private schools that are doing well with their population they have, and don't need more students who might need help, or can raise the money for scholarships themselves. One of the things we found through some research that really surprised me is the accredited private school systems in the state have lost considerable enrollment over the past 10 or 15 years. And so I think to some extent this is an effort to help them rebuild a student population, and they probably see that finance is a barrier. So I do think that different private schools will react very differently.
Some good commentary
Yeah.
there from Donna about suspension and expulsion, due process, special ed. And so this might be a good time for me to share some information that we've posted on our website. Is that good with you, Austin? I'm going to share the link.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay. We posted on our website this morning a toolkit that was just developed by the National Council on Public Education. It's a group made up of 50 organizations, including National School Boards Association, the school superintendents, the school business officers, the teachers unions, pretty much everybody who's on this call. And it's a pretty good anti-voucher toolkit. It gives a nice summary of the Espinoza case, then it goes into the history of school vouchers. It gives some very nice talking points about why policymakers should oppose vouchers, and it goes into some of the more recent information about private schools and the financial boost that they have received from the CARES Act and some other federal stimulus funding. They got Paycheck Protection Act. They got a lot of federal funding that we did not get. Now, of course, we got some federal funding that perhaps they didn't get. But the narrative that public schools are running out of money, or private schools are running out of money, or something like that, is not legit. So anyway, that toolkit, it's 20 some pages, and some of it may be a little bit wonky or in the weeds, but I wanted you to be aware of that. You could look at that, and we will be using some of these talking points as we work to counteract some of these voucher education savings accounts, other proposals that we know will be coming.
So let's stay on that thread, and I want to tie it to some of the comments Mary Sinclair has been putting in the chat about misnomers and challenges in communicating with legislators around vouchers and different stories being told by different people. So tied to this workshop, this content from that group, Leah, and the rest of the team, what are the stories we need to be telling around vouchers? What do we need to be communicating to our representatives into the legislature? What's that look like, and how do we formulate those? And I'll drop into the chat the contact information for both the Senate and House committees while you talk about that.
Thanks, Austin. Mark or Scott, you want to?
Yeah, Scott, since Scott has been working with a group of other organizations and districts that we work with on this, precisely to put together some of those, let's see what he has to say.
Well, I guess I'm like Mark said, we're trying to align a statement with other education organizations to address this voucher issue. I'm kind of in talking point overload at this point. And but what we're trying to do, basically this statement was going to be about House Bill 2068 and the tax credit program. But since we're seeing more bills being filed, like on the education savings account, I think we're probably going to work on putting out a statement that is more general or global in perspective, and just focusing on that we should be focusing on funding our public schools and focusing on the unfairness to students and families of taking public tax dollars and putting it into a private system. And so these are some of the themes. I think Mark and Leah, very accurately pointed out that, this program, this expansion bill absolutely does not focus on the students who are struggling at risk. And this could make some of our public schools places for students who are not accepted by private schools. So we're going to be trying to build some core messages that we can send out and get our people to sign up on. But I mean, I'll let Mark and Leah talk about the things that, you all could be doing to contact your legislators and things like that.
Well, I know you get sick of us telling you to contact your legislators, but as we often say, your legislators care more what you think than what Leah or I think. So the fact of the matter is, the supporters of these programs will be there in force. It has become in some ways a partisan issue. And so if they aren't hearing from others of their own constituents on these issues, it's going to be very difficult to probably change any minds. And so to some extent, I guess we've laid out some of the reasons we typically use. We would certainly welcome further, either why are you worried about it? We hope you're channeling your concerns, because as long as I've worked for KSB, we've had this position. But is that because, well, you've always told it's a bad thing, or you have your own stories about that? Any way you can talk about your own experiences in your district, what it can mean in your district, I think that's the most powerful. My personal feeling is that the strongest argument is not to get into our good or bad or who's right or wrong. It's simply saying, if you allow public funding for institutions that don't have to support every child and be selective, you invariably move toward kind of a two-tier system, one for the most successful, one for the haves, one for the have-not. Even if nobody means to do that, even if everyone's completely sincere in what they want to do, that's the fear, because none of these bills really have anything to keep that from happening. So in the long run, that means, because again, if you sort of assume that probably private schools are not ever going to have the capacity to really take that many kids anyway, you're still going to have a system, and we want it to be the best possible system for all kids and be available for all kids. So again, many reasons we're talking about, but I think to me it has to come back to the focus on the child, what it means, why giving that student who's having trouble, why that bullied kid who isn't doing well, why that child is falling behind, why we can't throw them a lifeline. Well, in and of itself, it's hard to argue. But the real question is, what is the collective result of all of those decisions, as opposed to refocusing our efforts to help every child be successful in our public schools, which is what we want.
And I would just add, strategically, I think we all can see that these bills are going to come out of committees and will probably be approved in the chambers. And so we're relying on the governor to veto this kind of legislation. And then the issue becomes, are there enough votes to sustain that veto?
And I would like to point out that if some of you on this Zoom have brand new legislators this year, this would be a really good opportunity for you to reach out to them and say, hey, we know you're going to be debating these bills. You may not be really familiar with this. Here's the impact that it would have on our public schools. And I know you're a public school supporter, and we as your local school district and as your direct constituent would ask you to either vote against the bill or vote to sustain the veto.
But I do want to add one thing, because there's a little other news I want to make sure we give any time for further reaction. A strategy that depends on on sustaining a governor's veto is good for 2 years, maybe longer. We don't know.
Good point.
But ultimately, if Kansas keeps electing legislators that feel this way, we're probably not going to be successful. So I guess the real question is, what can we all do to rebuild the trust and confidence in public education, and to demonstrate that we're providing those choices and options and programs to help students be successful? Because as I always say, the only way these work is if kids leave. If you're offering scholarships and nobody takes them because they're happy, then it doesn't really matter. And that's why personally, I don't think many kids would leave, because I think we have very strong schools that are responsive to their kids and parents. But we know some are unhappy and some will. And we know, unfortunately, in this time of COVID crisis, and it's certainly strategic, we know now, when a higher percentage of people are frustrated with their public schools, is why these are getting renewed attention right now. But I just think it still comes back to what do we do to demonstrate that public schools work and they work for all kids. And I think that's ultimately our best argument. And when there isn't that feeling, when we lose that confidence, that's when we really have trouble, because it has to be public attitude. The governor can help us for a while, and I think she would, and 2 more years or 6 more years or whatever. But in the end, it's what the people of Kansas ultimately think. So I want to, just before we break and we come back, just would note, I just got an update that on Tuesday, the House Education Committee has called a hearing on House Bill 2086 on emergency medication. I know Leah's preparing testimony on that, so she may want to explain that. And they're also having a hearing on a bill dealing with the Students' Right to Know Act, dealing with post-secondary options. This is another bill from last year. I believe it passed the House. It basically directs the State Board of Education and the State Board of Regents to provide certain information. But Leah, do you want to give a quick review of what that emergency medicine bill is?
Yes, I will. And then before we leave the voucher issue, I just want to do a quick housekeeping thing. So somebody remind me when I get done with emergency medication. So you may remember the bill from last year would allow schools, say your school nurse, to keep a few extra EpiPens or inhalers in the school office in the event of an emergency and a child either has an expired device that's not going to deliver the medication, or perhaps you have somebody on campus and they suddenly have an anaphylactic reaction to something, and you need to have a couple of extra EpiPens or whatever on hand so that you could treat that person. That was moving toward some resolution, and then the session ended. And so we were asked just a week ago, I think, by the School Nurses Association if we would consider supporting the bill again. And they've actually updated it a little bit to specifically say that not only could schools keep these medications on hand and it would be prescribed by a local pharmacist, but schools specifically would be exempted from civil liability for hiring or contracting with a person who would extend that life-saving medication in a true and sincere expectation that the person is having a life-threatening emergency that needs to be treated. So, the bill was pretty decent last year, and we supported it, and we will support it again this year. We've already submitted some testimony based on the draft bill that we saw. So that is emergency medication that we'll be testifying on next week. Back to housekeeping about testimony against voucher bills. As Mark noted, we don't yet have a bill number in the Senate Ed on Tuesday, so I'm not sure how to do that. But what I would do, if you are planning on testifying in either one of these committees, I would contact their committee assistants, and Austin gave you that information earlier. I would contact them as soon as you get off this call, if you can. Just tell them, this is Leah Fleiter, or your name, not my name. I state your name. This is so-and-so. I will be either opposing or supporting this voucher bill on Tuesday. I will be there either in person or remotely, and just let them know, and so that you can get signed up and be on the list to testify. And then they should be
in writing.
Or in writing, yeah, in writing or orally, in person or virtually. And then they should reply to you with when they need the testimony. Usually they just need an electronic copy 24 hours in advance. It's one good thing that the COVID pandemic has done for us. We don't now have to submit, 55 double-spaced, two-sided hard copies of testimony on, 2 hours notice. We can now send in virtual electronic testimony. So that's good, especially for those of you who don't have access to business size copiers. But so what I would recommend you do, if you or your organization plans to testify, go ahead and contact those committee secretaries, committee assistants today or as soon as you can. Let them know that you want to testify and what your position is going to be, and ask them for their advice on submitting testimony and when.
Well, fantastic conversation on the pair of voucher bills floating around out there. I'll keep my eye on the chat. If anyone has any questions, comments, or viewpoints they want to share on that, we'll certainly get to it. But with the time left, I want to pivot just a little bit towards some of the federal news. Leah, obviously we inaugurated a new president this week and a slew of executive actions were taken. What impacts are we seeing at the federal level that might be coming into K-12 world?
Thanks, Austin. Some of the good news that we received is that President Biden has appointed as the acting chair of the Federal Communications Commission, the Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. And you may or may not know that Commissioner Rosenworcel is the woman who coined the term homework gap. So she's the one who came up with that term, which I think is a great moniker for the gap between kids who have good broadband internet and those who don't. And so that's a good sign that she is in charge of the FCC, at least on an acting basis. You can possibly hope that she'll be confirmed. We don't know how that's going to move going forward, but she's at least acting chair for now. So that's some good news. And in an executive order that the president signed the other day, he specifically encourages the FCC to assist children who, if they are still, in remote learning, that they need to have better access to broadband internet. The executive order really talks quite a bit about the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services working together to give schools the tools they need to either reopen safely or remain open safely. So a lot of data sharing and other assistance. But if there is still a need to operate in remote learning, the FCC should take a look and make sure that those students are getting the help they need to connect online. So, some good developments late this week with the new administration coming in.
Very good. Mark, Scott, anything to add as we move towards a close?
Questions, always welcome. But again, talk to your legislators about all the things we said, and talk to all your friends about talking to your legislators about all the things we said.
Yeah. As always, we appreciate your time this afternoon, and every Friday afternoon. We'll be here at noon next week to continue to discuss the ever-changing and evolving world of legislation here in Kansas and across the country. You can also get up-to-date information from our team, particularly on social media. They do daily updates based on what happens in the legislature. They're constantly pushing out articles to try to get you the information you need to be an advocate for your schools and your kids while the legislature is in session and even when they aren't. So continue to lean on us as a resource. We will give all the help and assistance we can provide and try to make sure that access to information is there for you. You can find a lot of that at kasb.org or by following our team on their social media channels, especially Twitter. So we will see you all next week, same time, same place for an advocacy update. Thank you and have a great afternoon.